Welcome everyone to today's event. We're honored that Thi Bui is giving the keynote address, and we're looking very much forward to hearing her comments and having a discussion. She's the author of the Big Read book selection, The Best We Could Do. And all of you know that Eastern's very, very fortunate to have received a National Endowment of the Arts grant to join other universities. And it's across the country, not just here in Connecticut, and with their local libraries. So it makes Miss Bui's book a community event, and that's an honor that she has bestowed upon our community. Thank you. I love the Big Read program. Every year I try to participate because it puts books with social and cultural significance into the hands of entire communities. And given the divisions in our country right now, this is really important that we do this as a nation. At Eastern, we know that reading is the most fundamental intellectual skill we have. It's the basis for every discipline. Every other academic skill we can master begins with reading. To celebrate reading is to celebrate the enormous potential in each individual. Thi Bui is a first-generation immigrant. She came to the United States in 1978 as part of a wave of people fleeing Southeast Asia at the end of the Vietnam War. I'm old enough to remember that and how chaotic that was, T, for you and your family. The Best We Could Do has been selected for an American Book Award, a huge achievement for an American. The book focuses on Miss Bui's family's immigration to the United States during the Vietnam War. But what's so interesting about her book is that it took her 12 years of research and writing to finish the story. She didn't just whip it up, right after her family's arrival. Now, at the age of 42, she has published one of the most important graphic novels in this country. This 336-page memoir illustrates her family's life in Vietnam, their refugee journey to the United States, and her own life building her Vietnamese American family here in this country. It's not a simple story. It's very complex. Thi Bui wanted to speak about Vietnam and the war in her own voice, and she needed time to develop those ideas and the intellectual framework around it. When she finally decided on the graphic novel as her means of expression, she needed to teach herself how to be an illustrator. And I commented about the illustrations behind her, and you'll see them when she speaks. They're incredibly graphically beautiful. She is a self-taught graphic novelist. So why is Thi's compelling story so important to us? Ultimately, her book teaches us how to say no to fear and yes to truth. Simply said, yes to truth and no to fear. It is an honor to have her here, and I want to thank you for sharing your family's experience in this wonderfully illustrated novel. We look forward to the discussion as well as your presentation. I want to take a moment to thank Julia Whitner, who's our gallery director, and Christine Jeffers, who is the grants officer for Eastern, for successfully receiving a National Endowment for the Arts Big Read grant. It took them a lot of work to get to this point. I also want to thank all of our faculty and the students for inspiring us to apply for the National Endowment of the Arts grant. And I want to thank NEA and the Arts Midwest for the grant. Also, my word of thanks and appreciation for the support of the Connecticut Humanities Council and Bloomfield Public Library. And finally, Dr. Jason, I want to thank you for moderating this session. Dr. Jason Chang is Associate Professor of History and Asian American Studies. He's also the director of the Asian and Asian American Studies Institute at UConn. We'll forgive you for being at UConn and for serving as today's moderator. Thank you, and I look forward to the discussion. Okay, I think, Jason, it's in your hands.
All right, I think what we're going to start with, our plan for this afternoon is for Thi to share a bit about her work, and then we're going to field some questions from the audience, and we've made a decision to expand that time and to then spend more of our time together in conversation. And so Thi's graciously, like come prepared to share some of some visuals, some images of her work that can perhaps help out. So we wanted to make sure that we have ample time for dialogue after this. President Nunez, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, and it's a pleasure for to have this kind of partnership, and really look forward to more work together. So
Am I on now?
Yeah, you can take it away. The stage is yours.
Gosh, thank you so much, President Nunez. That was a really personal introduction that I was not expecting. It's the introductions I'll be very honest, my time to space out and collect myself before speaking. But you've really shaken me up here with how I feel so seen, as the kids say. So thank you. We're going to make this personal, everybody, because there's really no point in doing things unless you're really all in, right? So this is a book that I struggled with for a very long time, and it's got a lot of tough things in it. Things that are tough to talk about, right? But that's the beauty of a book. There are things that we go through in life, especially I mean, everybody has this in some way, or shape or form. But I think with immigration stories, there's so much of that experience that gets there's so much of that experience that gets packed away, and it's hard to pull it out. It's hard to know when to pull it out because it has nothing to do with your present day, and it's really not cool to pull it out in the middle of a cocktail party, for example. No one knows what to do with your baggage there. But it is so essential to your being and who you are, right? So you have to let it out in some form. And I found that a book was the perfect vehicle to do that, because I could wrestle with all of my demons and make sure that I was doing it in a way that was comprehensible. And then I could just slide it across the table to you, for you when you were ready for it. And I'm so thankful for all the facilitators of those conversations. Without them, my book would not have reached you. I apologize that it's required reading. I hope that it didn't take away from the pleasure of your reading. But I am really grateful for the scale of things. It's really beyond my wildest dreams. And honestly, as life dreams go, I've now fulfilled my life dream to make this book, to write this love letter to my parents and my country of origin. So I'm good. I just want to spend the rest of my life being useful in some way. So I did get a chance to debrief with Dr. Jason Cheng beforehand, to just learn a little bit about this audience. And I understand from Dr. Wintner that themes of immigration have come up, themes of belonging and reactions to new waves of migration, whether they be positive or negative, have come up. So I'm going to sort of tailor my talk today to those themes and those concerns, and I'd love to hear what other concerns you have. I also remember very vividly what it's like to be 19, 20, and figuring out who you are. So I'll be talking a lot about that too. So if you'll permit me, I think in words and pictures. So I'm going to show some pictures while I talk. So we'll do a little show and tell first. The book is getting to travel the world. It's getting to live in new iterations. This is a cover in progress right now. I need to proof this as soon as I get off with you. This is for the Taiwanese edition of The Best We Could Do. This is for the mainland China edition. And again, beyond my wildest dreams, that my book is out there like another person, like a grown child, kind of. getting to have its own relationships with people in the world. It's incredibly exciting. But back to the origins of it, when it was just a seed in my head, this was a note that I made to myself to tell myself, to state my thesis, basically, what I was trying to do with this project. And my son, who's now almost 16 years old, was just a baby then. And I said to myself that I hold my baby close and write with confidence that some things are good to forget, like childbirth, and some things should not be forgotten, like history. And I collect my family stories not because we are special or different, but because they're necessary for me to piece together, to remember the reasons why we left Vietnam, why there was so much bloodshed, and why no Vietnam War movie has ever answered my questions. So I was a 20-something-year-old angry graduate student who had a lot of beef with not just popular representations of the Vietnam War, but also a lot of academic writing about the Vietnam War. I felt like it was stuck in this binary that wasn't true, because the Vietnam War, or the war that was in Vietnam, existed before the Americans got involved. I mean, it was a civil war that was complicated by becoming a proxy war, right? And so it is very difficult as a Vietnamese person to talk about it in solely American terms. And then also it is difficult as a minority, right, in the US to have to constantly explain who you are and why you're here to people. And it gave me this face a lot. I was constantly looking for representations of myself that I was not finding. And then eventually I had to make the book that I wanted to read. But here's the thing about being younger, right? Or being a minority, is you so often have to define yourself by what you are not, which gives you a really funny picture. It's all in negative. And giving myself the opportunity to make a book was claiming back that real estate for the things that make up not who I am not, but who I am. And that turns out to be a very difficult project because I guess it was very paralyzing. I was sitting on all of these interviews that I did with my family members as a graduate student, and I was feeling quite inadequate as a storyteller. I didn't know how to do them justice. And my thesis advisor, a wonderful woman named Dipti Desai, she kept quoting Edward Said to me, saying, all forms of representation are violent. And that was completely paralyzing to me because I did not want to do any more violence to my family members or to my people who had already experienced so much violence in real life. And it was actually the process of having a baby that sort of unlocked the key for me, because the baby has got to come out. You just have to do it. And so that's how I approached the book eventually. I just had to try. And then I kept iterating and reiterating until I got it close to right. I started to look at different things too, not just at myself and who I am not or who I am, but the things around me, the small things that go unnoticed that make up a culture, a people. And the thing about when you come to the U.S. as a refugee is you don't have a lot of artifacts, right? Like actually that is the artifacts of poverty are not too many belongings, or the belongings that you just sort of have because that's what you can afford. But they do actually make up a culture. And so I started to honor those things. These are actually the end papers for a children's book called A Different Pond, written by another Vietnamese American writer named Bao Phi, and which I illustrated. And I asked Bao what were the artifacts of his childhood? What were the objects that meant things to him? And they're very specific. Things like the incense stuck in a rice bowl, or the book that he remembered reading, or the toys that he had, the few toys that he had, or the pack of lined paper on which he wrote his first stories. The jar of nước mắm, the fish sauce that his mother mixed in an old mayonnaise jar. And then there were some very specific Midwestern things, because he's from Minneapolis, like hot, what's it called? Tater tot hot dish, and Jello with the fruit inside that he remembers from the lunches at the Lutheran church that sponsored his family. I don't know those things, but they were specific to him, and I thought that they were important to include. It turns out that specificity is what helps your art have a universal impact. The more specific we can get about who we are, the more real we become to others. I also spent a lot of time reconstructing memories, which meant drawing myself as a child a lot. And that turns out to be a very therapeutic process. Learning to have compassion for yourself, for the things that you went through as a child, and just feeling tender towards that child really helps you put some of this stuff in the past where it belongs and not carry it with you always on your shoulders. And actually, that applies to anybody that you're upset with. Just draw them as a child. It'll be very easy to forgive them. And then, you know, as therapy goes, some days are just quite overwhelming when you open up the Pandora's box that is the past. And if the past was difficult, some days you just have to let the sadness wash over you. This was a sketch I did. So I was sketching a lot in the days that I was drawing this book. Having a healthy sketchbook practice is a big part of being an artist. There were days where I did more crying than writing or drawing, and that was just part of the process. Okay, here is something related to a question that I've always wanted someone to ask me about, but no one has ever asked me about the little bio that I have in the hardcover version of The Best We Could Do. It mentions making mixtapes from records onto cassette tapes. It's a lost art. I spent a lot of time listening to my dad's records, and he had a lot of Paul Simon and Simon and Garfunkel and the Beatles. And no one has ever asked me if that influenced my writing. It totally has. See if you can find the page in my book that is related to this quote about, you know, a window in your heart. There's a clock, there's a very kitschy clock, a wooden clock in the shape of Vietnam that I think almost every Vietnamese family in the diaspora owns. We had one of those, and I spent a lot of time staring at it and imagining kind of a hole in my heart, the shape of Vietnam. I think that comes from this lyric. Okay, so that's a little bit of context to lead you into this passage that I'd like to read, that I picked out just thinking about what it's like to be a young adult stepping out of the shadow of your parents, but feeling always linked in some way that you can't quite put your thumb on. Have our parents ever looked at us and felt slightly disappointed? Such high hopes, so much possibility to fall short. And though my parents took us far away from the sight of their grief, certain shadows stretched far, casting a gray stillness over our childhood, hinting at a darkness we did not understand, but could always feel. These are the people I come from. Ma, Bo, Lan, Big, Thi, Thumb. I figured out, more or less, how to raise my little family. But it's being both a parent and a child without acting like a child that eludes me. My parents escaped Vietnam on a boat so their children could grow up in freedom. You'd think I could be more grateful. I am now older than my parents were when they made that incredible journey, but I fear that around them I will always be a child, and they a symbol to me, two sides of a chasm full of meaning and resentment. Travis and I moved to California in 2006 to raise our son near family, trading the life we had built and loved in New York for a notion I had in my head of becoming closer to my parents as an adult. I don't know exactly what that looks like, but I recognize what it is not, and now I understand proximity and closeness are not the same. How did we get to such a lonely place? We live so close to each other and yet feel so far apart. I keep looking toward the past, tracing our journey in reverse, over the ocean, through the war, seeking an origin story that will set everything right. So that was my treasure hunt. And did I find what I was looking for? Yes and no. The vehicle was the book. The book was the vehicle for asking questions. It's not a memoir in the sense of like a great person sits down and tells you how they got to where they are. It was really never meant to be a memoir. I was an oral historian by training. It was meant to be an oral history. But I am also very conscious about communication and how we, communicate difficult ideas to each other. I also was trying to get revenge against all those bad Vietnam War movies, and I was doing it on a budget. So I was looking around at different media, and I figured out that, or I just had a hunch. That the medium of comics, making a graphic novel, a graphic memoir, might just be it. And of course, I was influenced by some amazing books like Mouse by Art Spiegelman and Persepolis by Marjane Satrapi, which is deceptively simple looking. But here's the thing about comics. We cartoonists are really the floor tile layers of the literary world. Like if we do our work well, you just sail right over it and you don't even notice. And it was very fun for you to read in like an hour. It took me 10 years. If we don't do our work well, you trip over it. So hopefully you didn't trip too much. So like I said, a sketchbook practice was a huge part of the making of this book, because some of the thoughts arrive fully formed and some are very raw when they come. A lot of it was just spent staring at these old folks who were my parents, trying to figure them out, trying to puzzle them out. And I realized that there's an opacity to photographs that I really had to do without. And so it's on purpose that there's only one page where you ever see any photographs used. And I purposely left it to almost the end of the book so that you can spend most of that time in the book getting to know them as characters, which feel like people with, hopes and dreams and faults and funny expressions and, things that make people human. Like I'm just a two-dimensional image in your computer screen, but like you might hear my stomach grumble, and I hope that's a reminder that I'm just a human being in a body. And that was what I reminded myself every day as I was working on the book. These are human beings in bodies. What do bodies need to do? They need to eat and sleep and laugh and talk and go to the bathroom, and so those are the things, like the specific objects I was talking about earlier. Those human needs also make us who we are. And the places that we live in really shape us and give texture to our life stories. So I spent a lot of time looking at Vietnam, trying to access it through whatever I could find. It was a little bit hard in the US to find, accurate representations of Vietnam in the past, but I'm a research addict, and I just kept going and sketched and sketched and sketched until I could sort of memorize the logic of a place so that I could invent scenes that I needed to recreate when I was reconstructing memories. And then I had witnesses. My siblings, my two older sisters were incredible witnesses, and I definitely incorporated their perspectives into the stories that I told, even though as a storyteller, I had to whittle down who the main characters were. But I owe a lot to both my older sisters and my younger brother, who were witnesses to these family stories. And then the last step, I think, was connecting the characters to the places in which they lived. This was a powerful moment for me where I was reconstructing a dream that I had, and pulling back at this angle and redrawing the tiny apartment that I grew up in that felt so big. It was my whole world. But being able to pull back and look at it as though it was just a stage set was another powerful part of like being able to externalize the pain, the painful memories, and be able to look at them from a distance with some remove and some compassion for all of the people who played a part in that human drama. There was a chapter, chapter 3 used to be called Terror, because it was, about being scared all the time as a little kid. And the way that I got in the mood, the way that I prepared myself for working on that chapter was to rewatch every scary movie that my parents let us watch when we were inappropriately young. And I figured out that they were not scary to me anymore, most of them. I figured out that they relied on a lot of cheap tricks, like, a sudden scary music or a jump scare. But the one movie that was still truly terrifying to me was Stanley Kubrick's The Shining. And I figured out that the cinematography had a lot to do with that. So I picked up on those hallway shots, and that, when I drew them, they were a one-point perspective, which is great because one-point perspectives are simple to draw. And if you lower the angle to be, so that the camera is looking from the angle of a small child, then you see a lot of the ceiling, and that unlocked images like the one you see on the right here. So I'm often asked what was the most difficult part of the book. Some of it was like reliving difficult things, but it turns out it was also cathartic to be able to put those things into form and then be able to step back and look at them. And then people sometimes ask me, what were your favorite parts to draw? And those were always nature and water. Actually, before I figured out the whole book, I had this very loose outline that was kind of just thematic and abstract. Every chapter had a short description and a cryptic metaphor about water. That was what I sent to the editors in the beginning, and I have no idea how they understood what I was going to do, but it worked because it was sort of a description of not what happened in each chapter, but how each chapter was going to feel. And there's a little bit of vicarious living in these scenes. I have never gotten to lie under the stars and the moon like that in Vietnam, but my mother describing it to me and me drawing it, drawing that memory, kind of lets me do that through her stories. And water, I think, is a powerful metaphor to me because it has played such a role in Vietnamese history. So many people lost their lives or encountered violence on the water. So water was both a life-giving and a life-taking force. And so many of us can't swim. It's really interesting. A lot of people couldn't swim even though they were like throwing their lives to the wind and putting everybody on a boat. And I think that added to the tragedy. But I don't know, I suppose I still remain fascinated and scared by the water. And when I turned 40, I treated myself to some swimming lessons finally. So I'm less likely to drown now. Also, my son has trained to be a lifeguard, so he will save me. And then water as rain, and again, like it was such a blessing as for a storyteller to just add some element of like real life and scene setting to these memories that were somewhat displaced. My parents would tell me stories like, we would often go to the movies. That's a habitual action. How do you turn it into a scene? Well, you take a little bit of what you know about the weather in Saigon, and you know that summer storms are a really common occurrence, and the sky can just open up and pour on you on your way to the movies. So just imagining that that happened one night when my parents went to the movies, helped me so much bring these memories to life in a way that I guess helps you feel like you were there with them, I hope. I think I just put this here because I wanted to look at it again. I am asked a lot about color and why I chose that specific red-orange color. You know, the answer truly is that it was cheap to do one color. Black and white printing is the absolutely most inexpensive way to print art. But color, as you see in the difference here, adds so much emotional depth that I knew I wanted to have some color. And then it was just about picking the right spot color. I went through, you know, like 1,000 Pantone library options, tried out a graphic novel blue, a more reddish color, a more gold color, until I finally found this color that makes me think of like the dust that comes off the bricks and the golden afternoon light in San Diego, and the color of the orange apartment building, and the way that our old family photos, the Kodak photos from like the 1970s and 80s, are starting to lose all of their color except for the red orange tones. And here you can see what it looked like when it was just plain ink on Bristol paper. Another thing that helped me a lot, and this actually just goes back to asking questions as an oral historian, was perspective. It was really important for me to step out of my relationship with my parents as their child and to just ask them questions as though they were people, not related to me. So instead of asking them questions about myself, I had to really, really learn to see them as children or as a fellow adult, and just respect their hopes and dreams and thoughts outside of me. And then one of the last things I wanted to talk about was the power of juxtaposition. I learned from talking to therapists that people who are still struggling with trauma, the past and the present are blurred. Things that happened in the past feel like they're still happening, and that is the effect of trauma. And so juxtaposing the past and the present, to me, just unlocked a way to represent trauma without ever using the word. And then that visual device unlocked for me a way to tell my A story and my B story at the same time. You know, the A story being my family's story, and the B story being the global events that were happening at the same time that they were living. I had never known that there was a connection between my family's history and the US-Japanese war, but there was, and it was awful, but it really important to the family story. And so I just juxtaposed them, and that let me shortcut through a lot of 20th century history. There may be some writers and artists in the audience, so I put this image in there for you. Like, what does the process look like? Kind of looks like this. There are scripts with tiny notes on them. There are tiny drawings and stacks of these. The editing process is brutal because, unlike writing on a word processor, you can't just move paragraphs around. Anytime you move like one panel or change a page, like you have to recompose many pages. And actually at one point I had a month to edit a 400-ish page manuscript down to 320 pages. That's cutting 20%. It was really hard. But at the end of that month, I felt really art buff. And there's just something great about teaching your muscles to write quickly. And this is actually writing in comics. Like, you're writing with words and pictures in sequence all at the same time. And you need to teach yourself how to, like, shorthand facial expressions, actions, and the pacing of a scene all at the same time. When you get there, though, it feels really, really good. Actually, I'm going to stop there, Jason, in case anybody wants to ask me about what's next. um, I'll happily talk about that, but I did want to stop a little bit early so that we had a chance to have more of a dialogue.
Dee, thank you so much. That was beautiful, and I loved seeing the sort of the backstory to some of these panels and seeing your process. I want to encourage the audience to use the chat to you can tell us where you're viewing from, and also share questions that you have. I know for my students, I've asked you to come prepared with some questions that we discussed. So please use the chat. Maybe one way to get started, just going off of, President Nunez's very powerful introduction, I thought maybe I could share an activity I did with my class that tried to, use the brilliance of your story, the way you've depicted this intergenerational story, as a way to for people to think about brave conversations for themselves and their own families. And so it kind of distilled some of the dramas and some of the panels, especially, you actually showed one of them where it shows you with the four panels speaking to your father as a child. And so there's a basic kind of set of prompts, or say, I am the child of, and then name your parents or your older generation. I remember, a memory of them. And then the sentence, my parents struggled with, and then for them to complete that. Then using one of your panels that shows your neighborhood, but has this question in a block that wasn't ever verbalized to your folks, at least at that point in the story. So I asked them to write a question that they've never asked of their parents. And then going to that model that you have of those four panels, speaking to your father as a child, ask them to imagine the response that their parents had, speculate why they would respond that way, and then write down a wish that you imagine they might have for you, but not verbalized. And then for them to use some of your drawings as a kind of template for them to depict themselves and their families. And the range of questions were just so wonderful and very challenging. But I think it speaks to the way that the courage and bravery you've taken to share this story and in the manner that you have. It opens up pathways for folks to see themselves in an intergenerational context that maybe isn't always accessible to folks.
Yeah, relationships are so complicated, right? And I can imagine if your parents are thinking this hard about how they talk to you, they might maybe admit to, and I say this as a parent myself, like the things that they say to you are so much about this pressure that they feel to take care of you and to do right by you and to make sure that you're going to be okay. Like, I don't know that I really want to be spending so much time asking my son, have you eaten yet? But I have to, because this is my role. And it's tricky to like step outside of our roles in this parent-child dynamic, right? Yeah, I think folks here are at a really great age to do that really interesting experiment of what happens if you step outside of that role for a second and ask each other different kinds of questions or give each other different kinds of answers than you've been used to. What do you learn? There's probably a lot, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Michael Rouleau, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, asked, through this process of getting to know, of trying to objectively get to know your family through interview, how has your relationship or impression of your father changed?
The book was a really great way to spend quality time with him. it was the way to not talk about things that I don't want to talk about. Like, I don't want to talk about dinner. I don't want to talk, I don't really want to talk about health problems. Like, I know I'm supposed to, but like, it's not exactly how I want to relate to my dad at all times. It's so much more fascinating to ask him questions about his life, and it opens up a lot from him. So much that actually when we were at the end of the project and like the final manuscript had been sent in, he was still coming over and like telling me more stuff, and I was like, oh no, I can't do anything with this anymore.
Yeah, that reminds me of, one of the experiences I had that made me want to be a historian was, I was asking my grandmother about her childhood, and she kind of stopped me like mid-sentence, and she was like, "Why do you want to know about me? My story doesn't matter. No one cares about what my story is." And it like broke my heart, but it also demonstrated to me, like that some people, there's like this difference between like history with a big H and then the history that we know.
Yeah.
And you spoke to that, this sort of A-B story, which that is so wonderfully woven throughout the text. Yeah. So, anyways, that was a really wonderful connection that that it sort of inspired me to be a historian, but then also the connection to your work.
Yeah,
There's
the big history that we read in our textbooks is like the history of the victors, usually, right? And it was a cool writing exercise for me to like flip the perspective and go, I want to write about the losers and what it was like for them.
So one of my students is here, Johnson Huang. He writes, what is a piece of advice that you have when trying to branch your story to your parents? I'm second gen Vietnamese American going to Yukon and was raised by my grandma while my parent was born in 72. My grandma has passed, so I want to know more about my parent living in Vietnam and traveling to the US, having me, and then getting divorced.
Great question, Johnson. It, it depends on how reticent or how willing they are to talk. Sometimes you're lucky and you've got parents who are talkers, and sometimes they're like, why do you, no, let's talk about something else. If your subject leans towards the latter and doesn't really want to talk, then it can be useful to come at them with artifacts and ask them about the object rather than them. So like pull up a picture and ask them to like tell you like, when was this taken? Like, where was this? Like, who else is in here? Tell me about the background. Look at the background in photographs more than the people sometimes, and like pick up on the little details like a detective and ask them about those things. Always ask them about concrete things rather than big abstract things. Because if you think about having to answer the questions yourself, how easy is it for you to answer some question like, what was the most challenging part of your life? Like, you don't know. You're probably just going to make up an answer, to please the person so you can like get back to making lunch. But if the person asks you like, what did you wear when on your first day of school? Like, did you have shoes? Like, what kind of shoes did you wear? Like, did your siblings like, or where did you meet my dad? What were you wearing? What did he talk to you about? What did you like about him? The more specific the question, the more concrete the question, the easier it will be for the person to like pull those reserves out and give you some material to work with. And then it's your job to compile and then start to analyze and then come back to them with sort of hunches that you have about what their story is. And then you sort of propose it to them like, this is what it seems like the story is, and then they'll respond to you. But you have to do a lot of the work of piecing together the details.
I love those suggestions. Yeah, so, paying attention to the backgrounds. I always love visual evidence as a historian, looking at old photographs and sometimes you want to see an actual person, but sometimes the context just tells you so much about the situation and the framing of where the photographer was positioned, and thinking about all of those pieces of visual evidence is so rich. um, I want to come back for a moment to something you had mentioned before about using Kubrick's camera angle as a way to dramatize the position of the point of view that's used in throughout the graphic memoir. And I'm struck by the way that um, that there's a sort of children's narrative that is woven through that. And did besides having a kind of dramatic effect, was was it a conscious choice to draw from that perspective as to from a child's perspective?
Yeah, there's an old essay by Chinti Minha that like asks you to like take different perspectives, and one of them is a child's perspective, and they're all like um I think all of these like thought experiments are about like just trying to empathize, put yourself in the shoes of another person, um so that you can learn, right? And I think that everyone has been a child, so that's an easy access point, or it should be an easy access point. um I, I was very conscious about audience, and I wanted to leave access points to all kinds of readers. And having so many scenes about children and their experiences and how they understand the world was one way for me to make the book accessible to an unknown, hopefully pluralistic audience.
Mm-hmm. That actually speaks to one of the questions that Quan Tran, my colleague, who's at Yale, who's as a historian um, of the Vietnamese diaspora, and looking at the oral histories and other ways in which the Boat people have made home in different places around the world. And looking at how those places are memorialized and written into larger cultural fabrics. And she asks, could you speak to how the graphic memoir has been received within and outside of the Vietnam American community?
I was pretty nervous, honestly, the first time I was asked to speak to an older Vietnamese American audience up in Seattle. Um, it was it was I was chosen by the Seattle Public Library as their like one city, one read book, and they set up talks around the city in different environments. And I was used to, I was used to talking in an academic setting. I love talking to college students and high school students, general public, book festivals, all of that. I had never spoken to an entirely Vietnamese elder audience before. There was a translator because I'm not that confident about my Vietnamese. And at one point, I just told him it's okay. I'll try. And so I got up and I spoke to the elders in Vietnamese, and I always start with my apology that my Vietnamese is not very good, and they're like, it's fine, just go on with your talk. And they were hilarious. They were so badly behaved as an audience. There were phones going off. Like somebody like got up and answered a phone call in the middle of my talk in the back. It was very much like hanging out with your Vietnamese elders. It was amazing, and they loved it. They were so supportive at the end. Like one of them stood up and she sort of gave a speech about me telling their stories and doing them proud. I'm so relieved. um yeah, it's a terrifying experience making something for your people, because what if they hate it? um uh and it's also a gamble, because my politics are not exactly completely aligned, with the hardcore anti-communist politics of many people, many of the elders in the diaspora. Like I will not go to, the parades where we wave flags and things. So I feel very relieved that I have not been caught up in any sort of binaries that exist from folks having lived through a really hard civil war. And I'm grateful that they feel that I'm of use, to humanize our stories and to help more people understand them.
Yeah, thank you. Elizabeth Lane writes, how often do you journal?
I'm terrible now. I was really good when I was working on this book and a different pond, but the the one downside of having your book do well is that you end up, talking talking more than you write. So I think I maybe need to get better at hiding from the public so that I am a more disciplined artist.
Yes, I can relate. Okay, here Sophia Gonzalez writes, were there other thought exercises that you partook in to help you create the book besides trying to view your family story through different perspectives?
To be very honest, I had never drawn a graphic novel before doing this book. So part of why it took so long was it was a lot of trial and error. So who knows what I did. There are some things that I have learned since doing it that I can share with you that will be more succinct. One of the best pieces of advice I've ever gotten about writing is try to create scenes. Like we understand things in story, but when we tell stories, especially nonfiction stories that have to do with the past, we often sort of blur the lines between all of the moments that happened. And we say things, oh, there goes my stomach grumbling. We say things like, we would often go to grandma's house every Sunday, that kind of thing. And that is a nice story for telling over tea, but like when a reader reads that sort of thing, they cannot enter into any one of those visits. You need to choose a visit to grandmother's house and really give concrete details and choose a specific moment in place and time to focus your energy on as a storyteller if you want to draw your reader in. So the thought exercise would be things like, well, was your stomach grumbling on the way? What was the light like? What did you hear? How did you feel in anticipation? What was the look on grandmother's face when she saw you? Things like that bring the humans forth and bring the human stories forth in a way that reach the reader better.
Yeah, that's a great exercise, great recommendation. It reminds me of the conversation we had with some of the other high school teachers that we're working with who are been courageous and to step up to teach your book in Connecticut high schools. And one of them had this ingenious way of talking about the of reading the text with emotion and trying to identify how you were able to characterize emotion without the words, it's the visual depictions, and that to develop a kind of vocabulary, a visual vocabulary, as well as a linguistic vocabulary to talk about emotion. And I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about that, your process of showing emotion, because it's so connected to the story, just how you were characterizing that thought process of what aesthetic choices do you want to make to convey those things that aren't actually textually written.
Yeah, I took out all the descriptive language as I was drawing because I no longer needed it, right? Because it existed in the artwork. And so for me, the text, the words needed to be as pared down as possible and almost as emotionless as possible, because there was going to be so much almost sentimentality, right, in the visuals. Like I have a very, I tend towards the beautiful. Like I really like things to be beautiful, and the color was going to be very emotional. And so for contrast, I wanted the text to be very spare. Because I think otherwise it would have lost a balance. And I also needed there to be a lot of conflict played out in silence. Because in contrast to, say, Mouse, where the characters play out their conflict in like arguments and stuff, like my people are very silent. They hold it all in. And so I had to convey the conflict through pregnant pauses and, things that are unsaid. And so things happen in your imagination between the panels and in looks. I also pared down the facial expressions or the facial features as much as possible. There's a great book about sort of comics theory called Understanding Comics by Scott Macleod, and there's one chapter where he breaks down why cartoonists simplify faces. It turns out like the less specific the facial features, the more universal they are, which is kind of what the opposite is. It's sort of the opposite of what I told you about specificity earlier. The less specific the face, actually, the more emotion you can convey. So for me, how was I going to draw like specifically Vietnamese or Asian faces and also like specific people and also show them all these emotions? I had to develop a shorthand. And the stereotype about Asian eyes, being slanted and all that, is like not actually all that helpful, because then no one has any expressions and everybody looks the same. And if you look really closely, that's not how Asian faces work. For me, it was about the nose. So like I don't have much of a bridge. So like if you look at how I draw my nose, it's just the bottom line, and the open face gives me a lot of like room to play with just very simple shapes, a dot and curve, a little squiggle here and there. All of these things shifted slightly up or down or closer together, create those expressions. And it took a minute to let go of everything I'd learned from my formal art training to learn how to cartoon like this, but that was a big key.
Yeah, wow. I'm just thinking of the, how masterfully you've designed those pauses, those kind of pregnant silences, between the frames. Just many examples of that throughout, and it does. I think that speaks to one of the reasons why it resonates with the Vietnamese refugee diaspora community in a larger way, because of as you said before, that trauma blurs the past and the present, and so giving sort of voice to those silences allows people to kind of step into that space, which they maybe don't want to, but you've done it for them. And
right, yeah, you can sort of talk about your family by talking about my family. It would be really useful, I think, if we had a Vietnamese translation of the book. And I've been working on that for years, but getting it published in Vietnam is difficult. There's still quite a bit of censorship around certain topics, and it's impossible to censor a graphic novel without being very obvious. So yeah, we haven't been able to do that yet. So I'm trying to find a workaround and seeing if we can find a smaller publisher to create the Vietnamese translation just for the diaspora and distribute it through the US.
Wow. Well, I wish you the best of luck on that. I think it's going to be amazing. That might relate to another question I have. I don't see any new question. Oh, here. There are more questions here. Let's see. Riley Roldan writes, was there any pushback in pursuing art growing up?
I was the lucky third child. You know, one sister went to med school, the other went to law school, so that took a lot of the pressure off. I will admit that's a huge privilege. But actually, um, my father really liked the idea of having an artist in the family. Um, but his idea was like I should go to like a 2-year college and get out early and start working and help support the family. And I was really lucky that my mother said no. She put her foot down and said, "You need to get like a solid education," and that let me go to UC Berkeley and pursue my other passions. So I got to like many immigrant children, I double majored in art and legal studies, and I thought, actually up till close to graduation, that I would go to law school and become a civil rights lawyer, because I was inspired by ethnic studies and learning about the incredible work done by advocates. It was my sister in law school at the time who talked me out of it and said, "You'll be much happier in art school."
Oh man, this is great advice from an older sibling. Yeah, we have another question from Sophia here, which she says, I know a lot of immigrants, especially those who migrate involuntarily, particularly as children, feel a sort of imposter syndrome, like internal conflict, when they try to define who they are versus who they are not, as you said. Did you ever go through something like that? And if so, how did you work through those difficult emotions?
Yeah, no, the imposter syndrome is real. It's every day, and it has to do with a lot of things. But yeah, imposter syndrome around one's own culture, like that whole binary of like, am I Vietnamese or am I American? It's a false binary. A culture doesn't really work that way, and when you have elders who are imposing um, their version of, the original country's culture on you, sometimes you don't like it just because it's old. To be very frank, like I didn't want to do ribbon dancing, or because it's kind of, I just didn't want to do it. But I really enjoy listening to Thi Bui rap in Vietnamese. Like that's cool. Um, so my parents and their generation, they expressed a lot of anxiety that like my generation would lose our culture and become completely Americanized. But like I wrote a whole book, about about our country and our people, and I talked to the young folks, and like a lot of them speak really great Vietnamese because they go back to Vietnam and they use their resources, they use the internet, and they're continuing to add to the culture. Culture is dynamic. You are part of the culture just by being you. So reject the false binary. Be you. Be curious, and don't be ashamed either.
Mm. Mm. Yeah, that connects to sort of connects to another question from Jolie Budzinski. She writes, "Hi there, I'm a high school teacher at Connecticut River Academy. Thank you for sharing with us. My students who are here with me would like to ask, did the writing give you some kind of closure, or did you have more questions than before?"
That is a really good question. It was such a struggle to create the book that, when it was done and my dad was still coming over with like more stories, and I was just kind of like, that ship has sailed. Like I was given the opportunity when the paperback was coming out to like add back in some pages, because I had to cut 20% of the story, and I was like, no. I'm done. I'm good. So when I look at the book now, it is full of flaws. Like I don't look at it and say, "Ooh, that is masterful." I kind of
Mm,
cringe at a lot of the
mm,
pages, but I also have learned to have compassion for myself. Like this book is a time capsule of what I
mm,
was able to do at that time and what my understanding of things was at that time. And that's fine. This is what we make as humans, is records of our existence, and records of who we were and our own biases and limitations when we made these things. I'm completely comfortable with that. And I have so many other burning questions now that drive me, and make me want to make new work.
mhm. Yeah, I know from my own experience that, when a going down a research path. I love what you said before about being a research addict. You know, that in the pursuit of a question, you end up learning stuff about yourself. You end up learning, you know, about other things that you didn't even intend to learn about, and that just that process of opening up yourself to this kind of genuine curiosity, and it really is, you know, takes you to places you didn't intend to go.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, whether that's, you know, emotionally, or, you know, for, you know, your own internal narrative, or also just that it physically takes you to places you didn't intend to go.
Yeah, I would say just if you have that in you, hang on to it for as long as possible. And it helps with the imposter syndrome because it distracts you from it. There's so much pressure that we put on ourselves to perform and to do like what we think people are expecting from us. And that makes you miserable every single time. But if you want to be happy in life, like follow your passions, like pursue the things that you're interested in, approach life with questions rather than statements, and you'll never be bored.
I would like to follow up that question, that what you just said there, with asking you a little bit more about your grant from Fund for Teachers,
Mm.
and how you pursued that, and how did it contribute to your teaching? I'm really invested in seeing, you know, teachers in Connecticut become more confident and competent to teach Asian American and Pacific Islander studies, and I think the Fund for Teachers is such a fantastic program. Could you speak a little bit about that?
Sure. Growing up poor, like I knew that my parents were not going to be able to send me to college. So I started the hustle really early on. I think that was like my first experience as a writer, was like writing all these essay applications to convince people to give me money. So I got really good at that. And then I continued it as a teacher. Mostly all of the grants I got were to like get stuff for my students. The one thing that I got for myself was the Fund for Teachers grant, and that let me go to Vietnam and take my mother as my guide. So we went to all the places that we had lived in as a family, and I asked her questions while we were there and interviewed people and just took in the country because I really had only been there once before as an adult. And that was a huge, huge part of the visual research for the book. When I came back, it wasn't like I was going to come back and sort of whip out the book in the summer before school started. It was more like, okay, now I have a process to share with my students. And so, and you know this from teaching, is that it takes up a lot of your time and energy, and you don't have too much juice left at the end of the day for your own artistic practice. So I was yearning to work on this book, but I was teaching full time. So I made my students do the project. I had them tell their stories. I had them do oral histories with people and draw them as comics. And later on, when I moved to California and started Oakland International High School, I went even deeper because all of the students there are immigrants themselves. So I had them tell their immigration stories in the form of comics, so that I could work on mine vicariously through theirs, through being their editor and guide through the process. So I have a huge like debt to these students who taught me so much about that process, and sort of pushing them to dig deeper into their own stories taught me a lot of these questions that I used, these thought exercises that I'm sharing with you today.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's wonderful. That's wonderful. Maybe this might be a nice time to, if you have any thoughts on the role of art in an interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary education. I love that you're combining illustration and oral history, and I read somewhere that you teach a class called Graphic Oral History, class I would love to take. But if you could speak a little bit about, because the way that the art, or putting yourself into mode of creative expression, I think, provides these chances for knowledge to be combined and articulated in ways that a sort of disciplinary kind of, if you're just doing, say, sociology or psychology, just those the connective tissue between those ways of knowing.
Yeah, I think art keeps you humble.
Mm.
A lot of people think of like artists as like these highfalutin folks, and maybe that has to do with the pedestals that like artists have been put on. But I think that the process of making art really, really keeps one humble, because it's hard. It's hard to make things, and it keeps you accountable to your audience. So I feel like I can BS a lot easier in an essay or in an email, or in a talk, but I'm really trying not to. In art, I can't, because you'll see it. And you were saying earlier, before we started, Jason, that like I think Zoom has turned us all a bit into production engineers. Like that's part of the humbleness of I'm talking about, of making stuff, is like you need to, you need to make things look good on the page. You need to like pay attention to page margins and your font and your color and your paper that you print on. You need to worry about all of those things, and they're not irrelevant details. They all add up to make the end product. So I spend as much time like handling those sort of like nitty gritty concrete details as I do like working with like themes and big abstract ideas. So I think when in education, we set our students up to make things. I love project-based learning. It helps them connect all the dots. They understand that learning isn't just the big ideas and the abstract concepts. It's also how you put it all together to share it with others. And I think it gives them some ownership also over the knowledge. So it's not just a regurgitation of things that they heard and then they put it back together, but like having to decide what you're going to make, and then having the courage to like actually like go forward with a vision and then learn all the skills that you need to make it. That really makes you own your learning process.
Well, in those choices of what to do and how to tell the story, Kathleen Hulser writes, did your siblings agree with your version of the past in this book?
Yeah. Consent is really important. So they had all seen like drafts and things ahead of time. And actually, they'd like all read like transcripts of their interviews. So I was constantly checking in with folks before this ever went to the editor. It would have been a terrible idea to just like publish this book and then have them read it. No. Don't do that to yourself if you're ever working on this kind of project. My brother held off reading it till it was all done in galley form. And he told me the best thing. He said that he always knew that he was like excited about it, but and that he would be proud of me. But he actually felt like gratitude after he read it, and that was huge to me, because it meant that he liked the way that I did it.
Oh, that's beautiful. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. We have another question from my colleague Kwan. She writes, one of the things that I really appreciate about The Best We Could Do is how far back you push the timeline for thinking about Vietnamese American history and the stories in this work. Do you say more about how you think of the concept of time and history in this? I would like to add a little bit onto that, just to ask about, so in addition to that bit about drawing this longer kind of arc past, you had mentioned going beyond the war narrative of the Vietnam War. But then I'm also thinking of the ways that the story of Vietnamese independence struggles can also be interpreted as decolonization. And is this an association that you think of? And how do you define decolonization? And what role do refugees play in the diaspora in that?
Jason, that was a multi-part question. I'm going to try to break that one down.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, when the title of the book changed when I figured out that it was a lot about parents and children and not just about refugees. And then also the through line became more apparent to me when I realized that it was about yearning for independence, whether it's a child yearning for independence from their parents or a country, a people yearning for independence from colonizers and imperialists. And the cost, the incredible cost that comes with fighting for freedom. And the complications that arise also when people don't agree what that looks like. So yeah, it was important to go way back. Decolonization, it's hard work, right? It requires upending the power dynamics, but it also requires going deep into one's own personal biases. Really, like decolonization for me with my family, there's like micro ways of doing it, like just questioning, gosh, is like European magi really better than Chinese magi? Like, I don't know. Let's look at the ingredients. Wow, the Chinese one actually doesn't have any MSG, and it costs like a quarter of the one from Europe. Like, I'm hoping that there are folks in the audience who know what I'm talking about here, or you know, just kind of reconciling like the fact that like we have like banh mi, you know, is made with like French bread, and it's such a part of like our like Vietnamese food, right? But it's like this French thing that like got added on. But then like, you know, looking at the Vietnamese language, that are, you know, before we were given this alphabet that was created by, you know, Portuguese and French missionaries, we used the Chinese writing system, and so much of our language comes from China, and so much of our dominant culture comes from China. So decolonization is like a never-ending process of like pulling back the layers and pulling back the layers. And I don't know that you ever really get to the center. I think the layers are part of the culture also, because culture is dynamic, and so we have been shaped by all of these forces. And I would never ever agree with somebody that uses that as any sort of justification for colonization. But I think I just sort of accept it as the reality of the impact of colonization is that culture gets muddled. Our waters have been muddied, and these are the waters from which we were born. And so I think just in our existence, we're huge puzzles and problems. That's okay.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. I'm gonna look through here. Other questions?
I will add one more thing. Like, similarly, you know, it's weird for me to be writing a book in English, right? Like, but I can't do anything about that. That is the language that I speak and write best. So here you are, this Vietnamese kid writing a critique of American intervention in Vietnam in English.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which I think, you know, speaks to the importance of these fields of ethnic studies, you know, not just Asian American studies, for holding those spaces and for you know, demonstrating the that these aren't just, you know, individual narratives, right? That these are stories about the nation, about lots of different experiences beyond even now looking at the refugee crisis in Afghanistan.
Right.
like these are, experiences that kind of, transcend because of those connections to complicated relationships of power and, and imperialism. And those aren't things that can, there's a lot of inertia, of movement, and
Yeah.
history
Yeah,
across
sometimes
all
the
those.
24-hour news cycle can make it more confusing rather than
Mm,
rather than like sometimes I feel like I learn less by watching the news too much because you get lost in the minutia and you forget the big picture. And to me, that is the role of stories and
mm,
storytelling and storytellers is that our function is to remind people what are the stakes and what's the bigger story of what's happening here. And sometimes those stories take decades to unfold.
mm,
And sometimes, the spirals of history are, decades apart.
mhm,
But people who have lived it and really paid attention, like the folks who remember the fall of Saigon, like understand what's happening with the fall of Kabul.
mhm. Yeah. I was just reflecting on here in central Connecticut in West Hartford, where I am. There's a Vietnamese, community here, and they had a night market that was going on like every other weekend, for some part of the fall, the summer and into the fall, and it was so amazing to see, hundreds of Vietnamese Americans just hanging out, cooking amazing food, and um, and then to think too that, some of them hadn't seen each other in years, and from what other folks had shared was that some of them hadn't seen each other since arriving in the United States.
Wow.
And it made me think about the ways that communities kind of evolve and change over time, and that it took basically 40 years for this community to grow and into the place where it is now, and at the cusp of learning about new Afghani refugees coming to Connecticut at the same time as having this experience of going to these night markets and seeing this joy and this community, really thriving. It, just really brought the kind of the gravity of that history and
Mhm.
the historical moment that we're in.
Yeah. The tragedy, well, there's many tragedies, but one of the tragedies of Afghanistan is that they've already gone through a refugee crisis. There are
Mm,
already refugees here who came at the same time as Vietnamese
mhm,
refugees, fleeing the Soviet invasion. Um, and I hope that, that community having roots here will really help the newcomers find, you know, find a way to survive and
mhm,
thrive as well. Um, I'm part of some Vietnamese American efforts to welcome refugees and get folks humanitarian parole to, it's just a drop in the bucket, but
mm,
um, our histories are so intertwined.
mhm. Well, we're almost out of time, but I want to leave the last word with, or the last question from my student Karen Lau. She writes, "Hi T, thank you for this book. When she asks, when your son reads The Best We Could Do, what do you hope he'll learn from the book and your family's story of survival and overcoming war?"
Well, this is a sensitive question. you know, teenagers they're gonna be them, and I think it's like part of their growing process to like not be you. So I'm trying to like tread lightly, and not try to impose too much of me onto him because he'll just reject whatever that is and do the opposite. And I don't want that. I don't want the opposite of me. Um, so I'm trying to give him lots of space to be him, whoever that might be.
Mhm,
Um, I do hope that he learns to be tough. The one thing I'm very proud of my family is the resilience. We we can do a lot. like we can handle a lot. We've been through some acute family crises in the years since our arrival, and I'm really proud of my siblings for how they step up when things get hard. I think immigrants are a really incredible self-selecting group of highly motivated individuals. But you definitely want immigrants on your side because, you know, people who can cross oceans and thousands of miles with nothing and rebuild, you want them on your team. So I hope he inherits some of that toughness and resourcefulness and resilience.
That's a beautiful note to end on. Thank you for that. I want to thank everyone who's been involved in the Big Read grant and for this partnership with ECSU. There's just so many people who have encountered who've loved this work and are excited to bring it to new corners, and just to share their experiences of reading it. I hope it is an event that we keep on coming back to, or a text that we keep on coming back to, and seeing the ripples of these conversations extend into our communities, into our families. And I'm really just grateful for being a part of this. Thank you.
Me too. I'm very grateful. Thank you so much, everyone.
So much, team. It was wonderful. Thank you.
All right. Take care, everyone. Good night.
Yeah. Good night. Good night.